Good morning, guys. Here we go. It's Wednesday, hump day. We made it. It's downhill from here, right? Smooth sailing. Today, I'm going to start on chapter 5 of Stuart Little, remember? We left off where Snowbell, Mrs. Little's cat, had deposited little Stuart where? In the mouse hole, right? Or at least that's what he made it look like. Really, Stuart was wrapped up in the shade of the window shade. You know, they have these kind that roll up, and he got wound up in there. And little Snowbell went and put his cane and his hat over by the mouse hole so that his family would think he went in the mouse hole. But he's really not in the mouse hole, okay? So this is chapter 5, and it's called Rescued. Are you ready? George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor, dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came back running with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in, and it will run down to where he is." George spooned out a bit of the applesauce and started to poke it in the hole. "Stop that!" bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's all call to Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about, and that he lost his way." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I will count 3, and then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. When they all called, "Stuart!" and then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. See him? Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am!" But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard, and Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons, but when the man asked for the description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at the section of wall which he thought was likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old, discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. George gets a little bit distracted, I'd say. There's the rowing machine. that he found in the cellar. What do you think the cellar is? That's a word, a word for another word. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All three sat down to a lamb stew, which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal. Each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart usually occupied, right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again and said she thought Stuart must be dead. "Nonsense, nonsense," growled Mr. Little. "If he is dead," said George, "we ought to pull down the shade all through the house." And he raced to the windows and began pulling down all the shades. "Who's in the shade?" "George," shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, "if you don't stop acting like an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it, to show respect for the dead. He pulled a cord and out dropped Stuart onto the windowsill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George, "look who's here, Mom." "It was about time somebody pulled down that shade," remarked Stuart. "That's all I can say." He was quite weak and hungry, and Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. "It was simply an accident that might happen to anybody," said Stuart. "As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance of the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions." It's the end of chapter 5. Okay, so I hope you all understood what happened there. George and Mr. and Mrs. Little went looking for Stuart, right? They suspected the mouse hole because Snowbell had put his things right in front of the mouse hole. But he was not in the mouse hole. He was wound up in the shade. And when they thought that he may be dead, George said, "Well, we have to, make everything dark to be respectful to the dead." So he went to go close all the shades in the house. And when he rolled down the shade in the living room, there was Stuart. All right, guys, I'm going to read chapter 6, and it's a little bit longer, but it does have more pictures, so that's good news. So here we go. It's called A Fair Breeze. One morning, when the wind was from the west, Stuart put on his sailor suit and his sailor hat, took out his spyglass down from the shelf, and set out for a walk, full of joy of life and fear of dogs. With a rolling gait, he sauntered along toward Fifth Avenue, keeping a sharp lookout. Here he is on a fire hydrant. You see him? He's got a long tail. Whenever he spied a dog through his glass, Stuart would hurry to the nearest doorman, climb his trouser leg, and hide in the tails of his uniform. And once, when no doorman was handy, he had to crawl into a yesterday's paper and roll himself up in the second section till danger was past. At the corner of Fifth Avenue, there were several people waiting for the uptown bus, and Stuart joined them. Nobody noticed him because he wasn't tall enough to be noticed. And here he is, what they're saying about, see, he's right there. And there's that dog. He's kind of scared of the dog. So now he's going to ride a bus, I think. Here we go. "I'm not tall enough to be noticed," thought Stuart, "yet I'm tall enough to want to go to 72nd Street. And there he is trying to get on the bus. You see him? He's on that man's foot. When the bus came into view, all the men waved their canes and briefcases at the driver, and Stuart waved his spyglass. Then, knowing that the step of the bus would be too high for him, Stuart seized hold of the cuff of the gentleman's pants and was swung aboard without any trouble or inconvenience whatever. Stuart never paid any fare on buses because he wasn't big enough to carry an ordinary dime. The only time he had ever attempted to carry a dime, he had rolled the coin along like a hoop while he raced along beside it, but it had gotten away from him on a hill, and he had been snatched up by an old woman with no teeth. After that experience, Stuart contented himself with the tiny coins which his father made for him out of tin foil. They were handsome little things, although rather hard to see without putting on your spectacles. When the conductor came around to collect the fares, Stuart fished in his purse and pulled out a coin no bigger than the eye of a grasshopper. "What's that you're offering me?" asked the conductor. "It's one of my dimes," said Stuart. "Is it now?" said the conductor. "Well, I'd have to a fine time explaining that to the bus company. Why, you're no bigger than a dime yourself." "Yes, I am," replied Stuart angrily. "I am more than twice as big as a dime. A dime only comes up to me here on me," and Stuart was pointing to his hip. "Furthermore," he added, "I didn't come on this bus to be insulted." "I beg your pardon," said the conductor. "You'll have to forgive me, for I have no idea what in the world there was. There was such a small sailor." "Live and learn," muttered Stuart, tartly, putting his change purse back in his pocket. When the bus stopped at 72nd Street, Stuart jumped out and hurried across to the sailboat pond in Central Park. Right here's the sailboat pond. You see it? Over the pond the west wind blew, and into the teeth of the west wind sailed in sloops and schooners, their rails well down, their wet decks gleaming. The owners, boys and grown men, raced around the cement shores, hoping to arrive at the other side in time to keep the boats from bumping. Some of the other toy boats were not as small as you might think, for when you got close to them you found that their mainmast was taller than a man's head, and they were beautifully made, with everything ship-shape and ready for sea. To Stuart they seemed enormous, and he hoped he would be able to get aboard one of them and sail away to the far corners of the pond. He was an adventurous little fellow, and loved the feel of the breeze in his face, and the cry of the gulls overhead, and the heave of the great swell under him. So here's Stuart again. He's looking out with his little spyglass, and he's looking at all these sailboats up here, okay? As he sat cross-legged on the wall that surrounds the pond, gazing out at the ships through his spyglass, Stuart noticed one of the boats that seemed to be finer and prouder than any other. Her name was Wasp. She was a big black schooner flying the American flag. She had a clipper bow, and on her foredeck was a mounted 3-inch cannon. "She's the ship for me," thought Stuart, and the next time she sailed in, he ran over to where she was being turned around. And he's going to talk to this man right here, see? This is a little picture. "Excuse me, sir," said Stuart to the man who was turning her, "but are you the owner of the schooner Wasp?" "I am," replied the man, surprised to be addressed by the mouse in a sailor suit. "I'm looking for a berth in a good ship," continued Stuart, "and I thought perhaps you might sign me on. I'm strong and I'm quick." "Are you sober?" asked the owner of the Wasp. "I do my work," said Stuart crisply. The man looked sharply at him. He couldn't help admiring the trim appearance and bold manner of this diminutive, seafaring character. Now, guys, there's a lot of big words in here that we may not have ever heard before, but what the man was saying that he thought about Stuart was that he was small, but he liked how bold he was in his words, asking if he could get on this man's little sailboat. Okay? "Well," he said at length, pointing the prow of the Wasp out toward the center of the pond, "I'll tell you what I'll do with you. You see that big racing sloop out there?" "I do," said Stuart. "That is the Lillian B. Womrath," said the man, "and I hate her with all my heart." "Then so do I," cried Stuart loyally. "I hate her because she is always bumping into my boat," continued the man, "and because her owner is a lazy boy who doesn't understand sailing and who hardly knows a squall from a squid." "Or a jib from a jibe," cried Stuart. "Or a luff from a leech," bellowed the man. "Or a deck from a dock," screamed Stuart. "Or a mast from a mist," yelled the man. "But hold on now, no more of this. I'll tell you what we'll do. The Lillian B. Womrath has always been able to beat the Wasp sailing, but I believe that as my schooner were properly handled, it would be a different story. Nobody knows how I suffer standing here on shore helplessly watching the wasp blunder along when all she needs is this steady hand on her helm. So, my young friend, I will let you sail the wasp across the pond and back, and if you beat the detestable sloop, I'll give you a regular job." "Aye, sir," said Stuart, swinging himself aboard, the schooner taking his place at the wheel. "Ready about." So this man, he is going to let Stuart take his sailboat out, okay, so that he can win a race against this, sailboat he doesn't like. "One moment," said the man. "Do you mind telling me how you propose to beat the other boat?" "I intend to crack on more sail," said Stuart. "Not in my boat, thank you," replied the man quickly. "I don't want you capsizing in a squall." "Well then," said Stuart, "I'll catch the sloop rod on and rake her with a fire from my forward gun." "Foul means," said the man. "I want this to be a boat race, not a naval engagement." "Well then," said Stuart cheerfully, "I'll sail the Wasp straight and true, and let the Lily and Bewarmouth go yawing all over the pond." "Bravo!" cried the man, "and good luck with you go with you." And so saying, he let go of the Wasp prow. A puff of air bellowed out the schooner's head sails, and she paid off and filled away on the port track, heeling gracefully over the breeze while Stuart twirled her wheel and braced himself against a deck cleat. "By the by," yelled the man, "you haven't told me your name." "Name is Stuart Little," called Stuart at the top of his lungs. "I'm the second son of Frederick C. Little of this city." "Bon voyage, Stuart," hollered his friend. "Take care of yourself and bring the Wasp home safe." "That I will," shouted Stuart, and he was so proud and happy he let go of the wheel for a second and did a little dance on the sloping deck, never noticing how narrowly he escaped hitting a tramp steamer that was drifting in his path, with her engines disabled and her decks awash. Okay, so there he goes. You see, he's on the sailboat. He's going to sail the little tiny sailboat on the pond in Central Park. So that's the end of that chapter. And so tomorrow we'll start where he's actually in the race, okay? So you guys, I hope you have a fabulous Wednesday. It's so cold outside. I don't like this. But I hope you have a fabulous Wednesday. And I'll be posting our last craft from the craft bag later this morning. Kind of sad about it, but that just means that we're getting close to the end of the year, which that's exciting too, because that means you're closer to first grade. So excited for you all. So I'll see you tomorrow, or I'll see you in a little while. Okay, bye guys, love you.